the war in Yemen 6 years ago. But on the ground in Yemen itself, there's a growing concern about an escalation in violence, notably in the central province of Marib, which is home to more than 1 million refugees from other parts of Yemen. Well, let's get more on that now with France 24's Nadia Massif from our International Affairs desk. Nadia, what has triggered this fresh spike in violence in central Yemen?
Well, the simple answer is that the Houthi rebels who control the capital, Sana'a, and much of other parts of the country have been trying to take Marib since the beginning of this year, and there's been a particular spike in violence recently. Now, we don't know exactly why it is. We're seeing this very large jump in the number of attacks in the past few weeks, but first of all, let me just show you on the map so we can kind of orientate our viewers as to what the part of the country that we're looking at. As you can see, this is in an area that has been controlled by the government for several years now. This is one of the few areas in Yemen that had been relatively safe, relatively peaceful. And that's why, as you said, somewhere between 1 and 2 million internally displaced people have made their home in Marib in the past couple of years because of fighting elsewhere. Now those people are at risk of having to be displaced again because of the scale of the fighting there. We understand that the Houthis are pushing for this area in part because it's very strategically important. It's got oil and gas reserves, which will be very important to the country, for obvious reasons. But, the United Nations is very concerned about the situation there. And our correspondent, France 24's correspondent in Sana'a, confirming to us today that in the last 48 hours, some 50 people have been killed. And it is worth pointing out that this is something which, apart from our correspondent there, is very difficult to get information from because it's very hard for journalists to get into Yemen, very hard to get credible information out. So these kinds of stories from places like Marib aren't really being reported much in international media, which is why we want to talk a bit about it today.
Yeah, indeed, this whole war, I mean, it's been going on for 6 years now, an atrocious war, terrible hardship inflicted on the people of Yemen. And yet it feels rather like in recent months and maybe even the last couple of years, really, we haven't been giving the war in Yemen an awful lot of airtime, have we? Yeah,
it's sometimes called the forgotten war. And I think there's a few reasons for that. Like, yes, of course, the war in Yemen is complicated, but I think that's to dismiss that idea. I mean, all wars are complicated. There are multiple sides in pretty much every conflict. But I think you can make an interesting comparison between the way that Syria is understood in kind of international news and Yemen. Now, Yemen is a far poorer country than Syria. Even before the war in Yemen started, it was already the poorest country in the Arab world. And that's meant that you haven't had sort of media activists who speak good English in Yemen, like you did in Syria, who were able to create these kind of very compelling videos, bits of social media to show the world the suffering of people in the country. And the other reason, I think, is simply the geography of Yemen. Because of its location in the Middle East, because of where Saudi Arabia is, it means that it's very hard, actually, for people to leave Yemen. That's why you have 3 million people displaced internally inside the country. So we have never seen in the past few years sort of great waves of refugees making their way over the Mediterranean towards Europe, arriving on our shores, forcing people to be confronted with the scale of the crisis there, which, of course, we did with Syria back in 2015, back in 2016. And just because, Yemen is a bit out of sight, out of mind, that really we should not forget the scale of the suffering there. This is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. 100,000 people have been killed, and there are many people who say that France, the United States, the UK are complicit in this war because they sell arms to Saudi Arabia, which has been bombing Yemen since 2015. And I think this latest battle that I was talking about in Marib, in the centre of the country, really highlights that 6 years into the war, the suffering is ongoing, and the Yemeni people are continuing to have an extremely difficult time.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed.